The new government proceeded with both progressive and reactionary policies. Maximum prices were established for popular products, rents were reduced, the privileges of the Chatapif factory were annulled, and hospital fees were abolished. On the other hand, the authorities intervened trade unions, closed the communist newspaper La Hora, and imposed religious education at schools. Perón and Edelmiro Julian Farrell, hailing from the Ministry of War, fostered better relations between the state and the unions. 53. As previously discussed, the Communist Party had aligned itself with the diplomatic policies of the Soviet Union. Following the launching of Operation Barbarossa and the consequent Soviet entry in the war, the Communists became pro-war and halted its support for further labor strikes against British factories located in Argentina. This switch redirected workers' support from the Communist Party to Perón and the new government. 54. As a result, the Communist Party turned against the government, which it viewed as pro-Nazi. Perón countered complaints by declaring that the excuses they seek are very well known. They say we are Nazis. I declare we are as far from Nazism as from any other foreign ideology. We are only Argentines and want, above all, the common good for Argentines. We do not want any more electoral fraud nor more lies. We do not want that those who do not work live from those who do. 55. One of the leading figures behind the 1943 military coup, Pedro Pablo Ramírez, was suspected of having Axis sympathies. The government held diplomatic discussions with the U.S., with Argentina requesting aircraft, fuel, ships, and military hardware. The Argentine Minister of Foreign Affairs, Segundo Storni, argued that, although Argentina refrained from participating in the war, it remained closer to the Allies, sending them food, and that up to then the Axis powers had not taken action against the country to justify a declaration of war. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull replied that Argentina was the only Latin American country to not have broken relations with the Axis, that Argentine food was sold at lucrative return, and that U.S. military hardware was intended for countries already at war, some of which were facing more severe fuel shortages than was Argentina. Storni resigned after this rejection. 56. The U.S. took further measures to increase pressure on Argentina. All Argentine companies suspected of having ties with the Axis powers were blacklisted and boycotted, and the supply of newsprint was limited to pro-Allied newspapers. American exports of electronic appliances, chemical substances, and oil production infrastructure were halted. The properties of 44 Argentine companies were seized, and scheduled loans were halted. Hull wanted to weaken the Argentine government or force its resignation. Torn between diplomatic and economic pressure, as opposed to an open declaration of war against Argentina, he opted for the former to avoid disrupting the supply of food to Britain. Nevertheless, he also saw the situation as a chance for the U.S. to have a greater influence over Argentina than Britain. 57. The U.S. also threatened to accuse Argentina of being involved with the coup of Gualberto Villarroel in Bolivia, and a plot to receive weapons from Germany after the Allied refusal, to face the possible threat of invasion either by the U.S. itself or Brazil acting on their behalf. However, it would be unlikely that Germany would provide such weapons, given their fragile situation in 1944. Ramírez called a new meeting of the GOU, and it was agreed to break diplomatic relations with the Axis powers, albeit without yet a declaration of war, on 26 January 1944. 7. The break in relations generated unrest within the military, and Ramírez considered removing both the influential Farrell and Perón from the government. However, their faction discovered Ramírez's plan. They broke up the GOU to avoid letting the military loyal to Ramírez know they were aware of his plot, and then initiated a coup against him. Edelmiro Julian Farrell became then the new president of Argentina on 24 February. 58. The U.S. refused to recognize Farrell as long as he maintained the neutralist policy, which was ratified by Farrell on 2 March, and the U.S. broke relations with Argentina 2 days later. Winston Churchill complained about the harsh policy of the U.S. against Argentina, pointing out that Argentine supplies were vital to the British war effort, and that removing their diplomatic presence from the country would even force Argentina to seek Axis protection. British diplomacy sought to guarantee the supply of Argentine food by signing a treaty covering it, while U.S. diplomatic policy sought to prevent such a treaty. Hull ordered the confiscation of Argentine goods in the U.S., suspension of foreign trade with her, prohibited U.S. ships from mooring at Argentine ports, and denounced Argentina as the Nazi headquarters in the Western Hemisphere. 59. According to historian Norberto Galasso, at this point, Washington held talks with Brazil, exploring plans for military intervention. The Brazilian ambassador in Washington is said to have claimed that Buenos Aires could be completely destroyed by the Brazilian Air Force, allowing Argentina to be dominated without the open intervention of the U.S., who would support Brazil by providing ships and bombs. 60. War's end. The German submarine U-977 moored at Mar del Plata, after being surrendered to the Argentine Navy in August 1945. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 gave new hopes to the pro-Allied factions in Argentina, who saw it as an omen of the possible fall of the Argentine government and called for new elections. The demonstrations in support of Paris soon turned into protests against the government, leading to incidents with the police. 61. It was rumored that some Argentine politicians in Uruguay would create a government in exile, but the project never came to fruition. President Franklin Roosevelt supported Hull's claims about Argentina with similar statements. He also cited Churchill when he stated that history would judge all nations for their role in the war, both belligerents and neutrals. 62. By early 1945, World War II was nearing its end. The Red Army had captured Warsaw and was closing in on East Prussia, and Berlin itself was under attack. Allied victory was imminent. Perón, the strong man of the Argentine government, foresaw that the Allies would dominate international politics for decades, and concluded that although Argentina had successfully resisted the pressure to force it to join the war, remaining neutral until the end of the war would force the country into isolationism at best, or bring about a military attack from the soon-to-be victorious powers. Negotiations were eased by the departure of Hull as Secretary of State, replaced by Edward Stettinius Jr., who demanded that Argentina hold free elections, declare war against the Axis powers, eradicate all Nazi presence in the country, and give its complete cooperation to international organizations. Perón agreed, and German organizations were curtailed, pro-Nazi manifestations were banned, and German goods were seized. The Argentine Merchant Navy was instructed to ignore the German blockade. 63. These measures eased relations with the U.S. when the Allies advanced into Frankfurt. Argentina finally formalized the negotiations. On 27 March, per Decree 6945, Argentina declared war on Japan and by extension on Germany, an ally of Japan. FORJA, one of the main proponents of neutrality, distanced itself from the government, but eventually Arturo Jauretche would come to support the government's change of position a year later. Jauretche reasoned that the U.S. opposed Argentina because of its perceived Nazism by refusing to declare war, although neutrality was based instead on Argentine interests, which were no longer at stake, with a declaration of war when the country would not actually join the conflict. Jauretche came to believe that Perón's pragmatism was better for the country than his own idealistic perspective of keeping a neutral stance to the end of the war. 8. A few days later, on 10 April, the United Kingdom, France, the U.S., and the other Latin American countries restored diplomatic relations with Argentina. Still, diplomatic hostility against Argentina from the U.S. resurfaced after the unexpected death of Roosevelt, who was succeeded by Harry S. Truman. Ambassador Sproul Braddon would organize opposition to the government of Farrell and Perón. 64. The final Axis defeat in the European theater of World War II took place a month later and was greeted with demonstrations of joy in Buenos Aires. 65. Similar demonstrations took place in August, after the surrender of Japan, bringing World War II to its final end. 66. Farrell lifted the state of emergency declared by Castillo after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. 67. In early May 1945, amid Germany's surrender at the end of World War II in Europe, two German U-boats, U-977 and U-530, then sailing in Europe, decided to flee to Argentina rather than surrender to the Allies. The subs reached Mar del Plata, Buenos Aires province respectively, on 17 August 1945 and 10 July 1945, and Argentina quickly handed them over to the American military after first summoning U.S. and British Royal Navy experts for interrogating them and examining available documentation. 68. Argentines in World War II. Anglo-Argentine pilot Maureen Dunlop recorded over 800 hours of service for the Air Transport Auxiliary and was featured on the cover of the Picture Post on 16 September 1942. During World War II, 4,000 Argentines served with all three British armed services, even though Argentina was officially a neutral country during the war. 69-70. Over 600 Argentine volunteers served with both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force, mostly in No. 164 Argentine Squadron 71, whose shield bore the sun from the flag of Argentina and the motto, "Determined we fly firms volamos." 69. Maureen Dunlop, born in Quilmes, left her Australian English parents to join the Air Transport Auxiliary. She recorded over 800 hours of service, ferrying Supermarine Spitfires, de Havilland Mosquitoes, North American P-51 Mustangs, Hawker Typhoons, and bomber types including the Vickers Wellington and Avro Lancaster to the frontline RAF stations. After being photographed exiting a ferry Barracuda, she featured on the cover of Picture Post on 16 September 1942 and became a wartime pinup. Dunlop returned to Argentina after the war and continued work as a commercial pilot who also flew for and trained pilots of the Argentine Air Force. She later raised pure-blood Arab horses with her husband on their stud farm, Milla Loquin Stud. 72-73. Nearly 500 Argentines served in the Royal Navy around the world, from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific. 74. Many were part of the Special Forces, such as John Godwin. Many members of the Anglo-Argentine community also volunteered in non-combat roles or worked to raise money and supplies for British troops. The Anglo-Argentine Fellowship of the Bellows in Argentina raised money to buy aircraft for the RAF. In April 2005, a special remembrance service was held at the RAF Church of St. Clement Danes in London. 70. On 9 May 2015, the remains of the Argentine volunteer group Captain Kenneth Langley Charney DFC and Bar were repatriated and buried in the British Cemetery in Buenos Aires. Charney was born in Quilmes, Argentina in 1920 and died in Andorra in 1982. 75. Nazi fugitives. Main article, Ratlin's World War II section, Argentine Haven. Before the beginning of World War II, there was a substantial German community in Argentina, a result of 19th-century immigration. Although this community was heterogeneous, including many German Jews, liberals, social democrats, and other opponents of Nazism. Indeed, it included staff members of the main German-language newspaper in Argentina, which was banned in Nazi Germany for its opposition to Hitler. 76. It also included supporters of Hitler and the Nazi Party, and Argentina hosted a strong, well-organized pro-Nazi element that was controlled by the German ambassador. During the war, Nazi Germany conducted espionage activities in the country and across Latin America under the aegis of Operation Bolivar, until the network was dismantled and most of its agents were arrested in 1944-77. In the late 1940s, under Juan Domingo Perón's leadership, the government secretly allowed entry of a number of war criminals fleeing Europe after Nazi Germany's collapse as part of the Ratlins. More than 300 Nazi fugitives fled to Argentina, including war criminals such as Erich Priebke, Joseph Mengele, Eduard Rashman, Joseph Schwamberger, Walter Kutschmann, and Gestapo Colonel Adolf Eichmann. 78. This also included members of the ultranationalist Ustaše regime from the independent state of Croatia, including its leader, Ante Pavelić. 79. In May 1960, Eichmann was kidnapped in Argentina by the Israeli Mossad and brought to trial in Israel, where he was executed in 1962-80. At the time, Argentina condemned the Israeli government for abducting Eichmann, demanding he be returned to face arrest and extradition through the proper channels. 81. This led to a diplomatic spat between the nations, which was solved amicably shortly afterwards. 82. In 1992, President Carlos Menem declassified several police files regarding the escape of Nazi fugitives to Argentina. 83. And in 1997, he created a special commission to investigate their activities. This, along with collaboration between local authorities and the Simon Wiesenthal Center, led to the arrest of notorious war criminals such as Priebke, Šakić, and Kutschmann. 78. In 2000, President Fernando de la Rúa issued a formal state apology for Argentina's role in aiding the escape of Nazi fugitives. 84.